Hello listeners, Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are tuned to the Nighttime Podcast, focused on the fringe of Canada.
Hello listeners. I have something a little bit different, but very, very dark for you tonight. The story we're about to hear centers around a world-famous professional wrestling entertainer who in 2017, while at the peak of his career, committed the brutal murders of two of the people closest to him, his wife and his young son. Why he did it and what led to these tragic events are still the source of speculation. And then there's the story of how this was handled by his employer, the WWE. Well, we're about to get into all of it. Tonight, in this episode of Nighttime, we're going to be joined by my good friend and a lifelong wrestling fan, Aaron Corbett. And our story is the rise and the fall of the Canadian Crippler, Chris Benoit.
Wrestling icon Chris Benoit had canceled a pay-per-view appearance at Sunday's Vengeance event in Houston, citing personal reasons. World Wrestling Entertainment says it asked authorities to check on Benoit and his family after friends said the wrestler had sent them strange text messages. On Monday, authorities went out to the Benoit's gated home in suburban Atlanta. There they found the bodies of the wrestler, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel in 3 separate rooms.
Aaron, I'm very fortunate to have you on this episode because you're going to be you're going to be able to make up for all the knowledge I don't have about wrestling entertainment, or as I call it, wrestling. You're a big wrestling fan, right?
Oh, yeah. My whole life I've been a pretty big fan of pro wrestling.
Let's just tackle this right out of the gate. For the people who aren't into wrestling, people are going to be like, it's fake. There's way more to wrestling than whether or not it's fake. The way I see it is it's more like theater. For me, at least, when I was into it as a kid, the wrestling match to me was only, say, 15 or 20% of the entertainment. What I always enjoyed was the storyline, and when they would talk to the camera and be like, I'm going to get this guy. All that stuff is what I was into. What is it about wrestling that you as a grown man still enjoy?
I guess it's the whole package for me. It has action. It has, storylines, like characters that are over the top, and some are not as over the top. But it's just kind of the whole production of it, from the backstage politics to the live crowd. And it moves so quickly, and it adapts so quickly, like on the spot, like nothing is written in stone and done over and over again until it's right. It's just, it happens right in front of you, and what you see is what you get. And going back to the whole argument about it being fake, it's a lot more real than the non-wrestling fan thinks. Those matches in the ring, like a lot of wrestlers, and in particular the one that we'll be talking about tonight, work a really stiff style where they're really laying into each other. And these performers are getting hurt all the time, and when they're taking these moves, a lot of people kind of chalk it up to, oh, it's so choreographed, and yeah, they're as safe as they can be, but a lot more real action happens in that ring than people think. Yeah,
and I think this story maybe highlighted some of that for me. When I was reading and learning about this, it was I knew there was a lot of injuries that came with the sport and stuff, but I don't think I realized it could be as bad as it is until I read and learned about this. For me, like as far as an interest in wrestling, as a little kid, I liked it, but I feel like I got out of it when I was, say, like maybe 12 or something. So there's been like 20 years of stuff that's happened surrounding wrestling since I lost interest. The guy we're talking about tonight is Chris Benoit. he came onto the scene well after I got out of it. So maybe you could tell me a bit about what brought him from, this small town circuit in Canada to basically one of the leading guys internationally for wrestling. Maybe talk through a bit of his history.
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about before his Stampede Wrestling days, but that's kind of where he came on the map for me and a lot of other people was, Stampede Wrestling in Calgary, which is famously run by Stu Hart, who's the father of Bret Hart and Owen Hart, the entire world-famous Hart family of wrestling. And Chris Benoit, really cut his chops in that organization. And that style of wrestling is really technical. The Hart family is really known for, when the bell rings, putting on amazing technical matches and really understanding the psychology of wrestling. It wasn't about being big and massive and over the top like Hulk Hogan. Like in that league, like you put on great matches. And Chris Benoit is one of his biggest influences was the Dynamite Kid, who spent a ton of time in Stampede Championship Wrestling. And the Dynamite Kid was most famous for his tag team, the British Bulldogs, with Davey Boy Smith.
Oh, yeah. I remember those guys. So Chris Benoit, he originally from Quebec, I believe, but he would eventually go through Stampede and be good enough to get recognized by the major leagues. Because I guess Stampede, you would consider that kind of like a minor league. Where did he end up? Like, did he go from Stampede to straight into WWE, which I guess would be the biggest?
His next most notable place that he wrestled was World Championship Wrestling. So Benoit started to become famous in World Championship Wrestling. And, we'll kind of talk a bit more about who he met and interacted with there in a bit. But that was his next big step, which then eventually, after WCW, led him to WWF or WWE, as it is now.
That gets so complicated because I knew it as WWF, but they were sued or challenged in some way by the World Wildlife Foundation, and then changed their name to WWE for like World Wrestling Entertainment. Which, it was that all happened even after I got out of it. But I know WCW and WWE and how that worked. There was the two companies that were basically competing for the spot as the biggest wrestling organization or whatever on television in North America. And so Benoit ends up in WCW. And the story that we're going to tell about this is really going to be the rise and fall of Chris Benoit. When we get to the fall of Chris Benoit, the person that's going to be involved and go down with him is his wife, who in the end was Nancy Benoit. He met her in WCW in a weird way because she also she wasn't a wrestler, but she was like a ringside entertainer in some way.
They would have called them almost like a female manager. You would call a valet at the time.
Okay.
At the time, when Chris met Nancy, a lot of the female roles in wrestling were as valets who would escort the male performer to the ring and support them at ringside, and also kind of be their manager as well.
All right. So she was in WCW in that role. The way she gets together with Chris Benoit was interesting. I watched the Vice made a documentary, The Dark Side of the Ring, and the way they told this story I found really captivating. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Nancy was the valet or like the support person of another wrestler, and a storyline was made that Chris Benoit and this other wrestler had this big feud, and within the storyline, Nancy left the other wrestler to be with Chris, but in reality, that actually like happened at the same time.
Yeah, so Nancy was a couple with Kevin Sullivan, who was he played like more kind of a Prince of Darkness kind of character at the time, and Nancy, I think her character's name was Fallen Angel, and I think it was based off of a comic book or something.
Okay.
And so they were a real life couple, and she was his, and then on screen, she was his valet, Kevin Sullivan's valet. So,
Okay.
yeah. So then in the storyline, Kevin Sullivan was feuding with Chris Benoit, and in the storyline that was kind of written out, Chris actually, lures Nancy over to join him, and she leaves Kevin Sullivan in the storyline. But then as this storyline was playing out on TV, behind the scenes, it actually played out in real life as well.
Like the exact way. Yeah.
The exact way, yeah. So it was a really wild kind of situation to happen. And that happens a lot in professional wrestling, because a lot of times some of the most captivating storylines are based off of backstage reality. And then it brings this element of realism to it that really pops on the screen. So they tend to go back to that whenever there's something going on. They like to take about 50% or 25% of that reality and make a storyline out of it. It's easier to perform. It feels more real. But this kind of happened in the opposite way, where they started a storyline that then played itself out backstage, during and after the fact.
Wow. And all accounts that I've heard of Chris Benoit, at least at this point of his life, it paints him to be this ultra dedicated guy, like completely committed to his career. Wrestling is the main part of his life, and his career is, beyond the number one priority. Like, what kind of reputation did he have from a fan's point of view? Because you would have been, following wrestling big time when he was rising up and getting to his prime. Like, how did you see him at this point?
Now, I would never have put myself as, I would never put Chris Benoit as, in my top, 5 favorite wrestlers of that era, because I did tend to lean more towards character-driven kind of performers. That Chris Benoit was not that kind of guy. His name was the Canadian Crippler, and his character, which typically is an extension of your regular personality, was just someone who bell to bell delivered. He was very respected amongst the performers in the locker room, and he was respected amongst wrestling fans because he was. When the match started, he was amazing. His matches were great. They looked real. They were intense. So his matches were great to watch. I always loved watching his matches. They were fast paced, but they weren't too fast. So that was something. And he was incredibly respected, and not only as a performer, but as a dedicated individual as well, as somebody who you could count on to always deliver.
And how big did he get? At this point, he would have been rising up in WCW, but was he among the most popular guys? Would he be considered a huge star? How big did he get at his prime?
You would kind of you would have your big, say, someone like Hulk Hogan is a main event kind of performer, but then you would have the upper kind of mid card kind of performers who you would see Chris Benoit kind of rest in. He was high up on the ladder, but he could never get to that full main event status because he was shorter. He was built, but he was still shorter, and he didn't have quite the look that you would normally see from a main eventer during that era. So that always kind of held him back, probably.
I can see that, yeah.
But his mic skills weren't great either. He could give you a promo, and he could do it, as himself, and he could give passion to it. But in my opinion, he had a hard time reaching into the camera and really captivating the audience with a promo. His biggest asset was in the ring, his matches, his technical wrestling. That's where he delivered the most. But, and he ended up in WWE being a main eventer. At this point in time, that's what I think was kind of keeping him from that top shelf.
Was there any major thing that would have brought him from WCW to WWE, or is that considered a upgrade or promotion or something, or was that uneventful?
At the time that he finally went to WWE, it was WWE or WWF was beating WCW at that point. consistently in the ratings. So by the time he came over, it was a no-brainer. And also, he wasn't getting the chance to elevate himself any further in WCW. So he had to make a move if he wanted to elevate his career, in the future. So the WWF was the only logical step at that point. It was out of frustration with WCW not giving him any further opportunities.
So at this point, Chris Benoit goes to the minor circuit, up to the major leagues. He ends up finding his place in WWE. I kind of, when I follow the story, I almost see this as kind of the peak in his life. Everything seems to be working out. We're about to get to things stopping working out for him, but we should talk about Eddie Guerrero, who's another wrestler that I think when I look at the story and lay it in front of me, I see Eddie Guerrero and his friendship and relationship with Chris Benoit being a major piece of this whole puzzle. Tell me about who Eddie Guerrero is and how he fits into Chris Benoit's life at this point.
So Eddie Guerrero was basically wrestling alongside Chris Benoit for a good portion of his career, all through WCW and probably a lot in they wrestled in Japan together and different things. So they, I think at first they kind of didn't get along, but then they worked together so much that they developed this professional relationship, which then blossomed into a friendship that became extremely close and extremely tight. So, and especially in WCW, they had a lot of matches together in WCW, putting on amazing shows, because Eddie Guerrero is in the same category as Chris Benoit in terms of the style of matches, the intensity, the technical ability, the realism. The matches they put on during that era in the 90s in WCW are still chalked up to being some of the best matches that you'll see anytime, any generation. So these guys formed a real bond. And they came over to WWF at the time together. So yeah, they were thick as thieves. And Eddie Guerrero is one of those special wrestlers that only comes around once in a while. Again, he had some of the same limitations in terms of height and size that Chris had, but something that Eddie had was intense charisma. Cool. Those two, their styles just meshed together, and so they became best friends.
Yeah, no. What we know now is Eddie Guerrero, I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong, Eddie Guerrero had a lot of personal problems. It sounds like he struggled with alcohol and drug abuse, yet he seemed to be able to keep his career on the right track. It didn't seem to have that big of effect. But what I read about him makes it sound like he was a step away from a junkie, but at the same time, what I read about him makes him sound like a top tier athlete, which I found weird. Was it known that he was having that Eddie Guerrero had personal problems when he was at the top?
It was definitely known if you kind of followed the behind the scenes gossip. So you would have an idea, and that was a really common problem in the industry. Was you're traveling a lot, you're wrestling, 320 days a year, you're on the road constantly, you're in pain all the time. So this is a common story that you see all the time with wrestlers as they start to drink more. There's a party scene constantly. They start to get into prescription pills to help deal with the pain. And then it becomes the only way they can function, to be able to deliver that quality night in and night out over and over and over again with no break. And with the road on top of that, it happens all the time. And he was one of the ones that fell victim to that.
Yeah, and it kind of makes sense. When you think of the life of a professional wrestler, it's somewhere between being a professional athlete, a rock star, an actor, and a carny. Because you're always going from city to city. And I could see how all those social problems would be all swirled up within it, but it eventually came to be too much for Eddie Guerrero. You know, the hard life on the road, any history he may have had with substance abuse may have played into it, but eventually Eddie Guerrero would meet his end due to, I think it was a heart disease that eventually took him.
Yeah.
I think he dropped dead, like, while still employed in, like, actively being a wrestler.
Yeah, he was on the road. It was in a hotel room, and he wasn't. Nobody was hearing from him, and then he wasn't. I think the hotel was calling his room for a wake up call, and
yes, that's right.
And he wasn't answering, and then they got a hold of his nephew Chavo Guerrero, who's another wrestler, and they broke into the room because they knew that he was in there because the chain was linked on the other side.
Oh yeah.
You know, the chain you see on a hotel door. And so anyway, they went in and they found him on the floor in the bathroom, and then after an autopsy, it turned out to be heart disease. Wow. And which I'm sure, you know, was brought on by the lifestyle that he was living. I'm not a physician, so I'm not 100% on that, but
oh, you're not a physician.
Sorry, I should have told you that before we recorded.
I just assumed you were a physician.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked earlier of how tight of a connection Eddie and Chris Benoit had. After Eddie Guerrero died, there was like this clip that I saw that was so touching. It was, I don't even know if touching is the right word, but the WWE did like a special to memorialize him on TV, and they had different wrestlers and professionals kind of coming on and talking about Eddie and the impact he had on their lives. When the camera goes to Chris Benoit, it's like he's completely fallen apart. Mm-hmm. You can hardly make him out. He's crying so hard. It's obvious how close those two were.
Eddie Guerrero is my best friend. We've laughed together, cried together, fought each other. We've been up and down each and every mountain, each and every highway. He was the one friend that I had that I could go to and pour my heart out to if I was going through something, if I had a personal issue or a personal problem, that he would understand and he would talk me out of it. Eddie was that kind of friend to me. And Eddie, I know that you're in a better place, and I know that you're looking down on me right now. And I want you to know that I love you. I miss you. Eddie, you made such a great impression on my life, and I want to thank you for everything you've ever given me. And I want to thank you from my heart and tell you that I love you and I'll never forget you. And I will see each other again. I love you, Eddie.
And that's the thing about Chris Benoit, is he always kept his cards really close to his chest. So he never really gave off that kind of emotion generally. He was, reserved and quiet, and he was so shaken and upset by the passing of Eddie Guerrero that he couldn't even keep it together on, television. He was after that memorial, like, he was constantly shaken up by this thing, more so than anybody else was. Like, everybody else was obviously sad about Eddie Guerrero passing, but there was something about the relationship with him and Chris Benoit that had Chris just completely devastated.
Yeah, and it seems like Chris Benoit really never got over it, and obviously he needed to see a psychiatrist or something, because it seems all the clips that I hear of people talking about Chris Benoit describe him being completely changed after Eddie's death. He was more withdrawn. He seemed, to even be getting like paranoid. And it sounds to me like he was just falling into like a depression or something. Like but it makes sense when you lose someone that close to you. And we've heard at this point, Chris Benoit is married to Nancy, who he got with earlier, and we heard that story. But I believe Nancy was even encouraging him to take time off wrestling. Look after yourself because you're a mess about this.
Yeah, and that's kind of when you're working that kind of a job and you're on the road with these other wrestlers, you see them more than you see your family. And you're driving with them, you're sharing hotel rooms with them, you're sharing your life. Like everything that's happening in your life is happening with that person. So when you get close to somebody in that industry, the way that Eddie and Chris were close, they're with each other 24/7. So it's when you think of it that way, it's not surprising that he would be hit harder than other people by the death of Eddie. But you could also tell that something wasn't right. He couldn't stop crying. He couldn't seem to find a way to cope with this situation.
And that's really what's going to lead us to the main topic we're discussing, which is the crime that would end several lives, including Chris Benoit's. Let's kind of talk through initially how this plays out. So Chris Benoit is to begin like a tour, we'll call it, like a wrestling tour where they're going to do separate, events. And I believe it was going to be in Texas. And we mentioned Chavo earlier, who was the cousin or the nephew of Eddie Guerrero. It's the events that lead that first show signs that something was wrong was Chavo was supposed to pick up Chris Benoit at the airport. But rather than pick him up, he got a call from Chris Benoit. I believe it was initially a voicemail saying, I slept in, I missed my flight, I'm going to book a later flight. But eventually when they get in contact with each other, what Chris Benoit would say is that my wife, Nancy, and their young son, he said they were both sick with food poisoning. They had to go to the hospital. I'm going to be late. I'm going to book a later flight. And Chavo seemed to be okay with it, and Chris Benoit ended the call with kind of an unusual, like, I love you, Chavo. And that's how the call ended, which, I don't know, in hindsight, it seems weird. Like, when you have a close friend that you talk to, and they say something that just seems odd, like, I love you, at the end of a call, like, I could see how that would kind of stand out. But yeah, that's really how this starts.
And I'm sure the tone in his voice also probably made it weird to, like, I could say to you, oh, I love you, and it wouldn't seem weird. But if I had a tone in my voice that was, very serious, you'd be able to tell.
When you know someone, when you know someone, I could tell right away if there was something up when I'm talking to you. Anyway, but that phone call, not weird enough to really throw up any alarms or anything like that. They were planning to get him at the airport, I believe, the next morning. But what happens is, throughout that night, Chavo and several other people involved in WWE start getting text messages from both Chris Benoit and Nancy's phone. Like, this is it in the middle of the night. I think Chavo was interviewed and he described seeing the message come in, and he just on his phone in the middle of the night, and he just kind of looked at it and went back to sleep, not thinking much about it. But these messages, I don't know if you had them in front of you there. It's two main messages he was sending.
Yeah, it's the dogs are in the enclosed pool area, garage side door is open, and then the other one said my physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane.
Yeah, and again, he was sending it from both his and his wife's phone to multiple people. It's hard for me to say because I'm looking at this with the benefit of hindsight, but to me, like, if I got a text from you that said that, I would immediately be like, what the heck is going on? That seems kind of weird.
You could assume that it was a mistaken, like they texted the wrong number or something, like they meant to text somebody else.
And if it was 4 a.m. and I saw a message from you and I managed to look at it, I'd be so kind of out of it that it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense anyway.
Yeah.
But regardless, the phone call wasn't enough to do it. Those text messages weren't enough to do it. It being throw the red flags up and cause panic. But what ends up happening is the guys, Chavo Guerrero and others, go to the airport to pick up Chris Benoit right when they were supposed to, when it had previously been planned. And he doesn't show up at the airport. They make several calls. They can't get him. He's not responding to texts. And it's not like a couple of friends going to hang out. Like, they have a major event that's going to be on TV that night, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think it is a pay-per-view event that he's supposed to be at. Mm-hmm. So that's a big deal because, at that time, people would be at home, would be paying, $50 or $60 just to watch that one event at home. And then, there'd be an arena filled with people who are paying probably $100, $150 a ticket.
Yeah, and Benoit's one of the featured performers on this event, so he's...
Yeah. At this point in time, he's on the upper end of the card. He's made it to that kind of elevated status in WWE.
So those text messages would have been Saturday into Saturday night. The event, that pay-per-view we just talked about, was planned for Sunday night. When he doesn't show up at the airport that Sunday morning, that's when panic starts. And what WWE does is they reach out to the police in the town that Benoit and his wife are living in. At this point, he's not living in Canada. He's in Fayetteville, Georgia. They phone the police there, basically requesting a wellness check. We have a major entertainer who has a major event tonight. No one can reach him. This is unusual and not like him. We want someone to go make sure he's okay. From there, police respond. Initially, and I can understand this, they would have been going there thinking he's probably, sick or slept in or passed out drunk or something like that. Like, that would have...
That would be the normal result of a welfare check.
I bet.
Probably. Yeah, they're like, from their experience, these typically is somebody, they were having drinks the night before, they slept in, and, so that's what they're probably expecting.
Yeah. And as the police show up, they are met by the neighbor, Benoit's neighbor, and it was a woman. She just happened to be outside. And as the police are going towards the house, there's a fenced-in area, just like the text messages said, with some big dogs. He had I don't know what breed it is, but the huge dogs that I'm scared of. And I think the police were a little hesitant to go in this fenced-in area with those dogs, and the neighbor offered to, I look after the dogs all the time. I'll bring them in the house, and you can go in and do your thing.
Yeah.
They let her do that. She walks in, the dogs follow her, walk behind her, and apparently what I read was that the side door of his house was open, and she just walks in the house with the dogs, and the police are just kind of standing there for a few minutes, and then she just comes out of the house screaming, "Daniel's dead. Daniel's in there. Daniel's dead." And Daniel is Chris and Nancy's young son. He was 7 or 8 years old. Of course, then police take over the scene, put up the police tape, and go in there, and immediately they realize something bad is happening. The police officers who were interviewed about this described a smell in the house. So they're walking into a house with the smell of death in the air.
Yeah, and from their experience, probably they knew what they were once they smelled that they were probably knew what they were walking into.
Mm-hmm. In short, without getting into the gory parts, is they find their son, Daniel. He's deceased in his bed. Nancy, Chris Benoit's wife, is rolled in a carpet and deceased in their bedroom. And they do find Chris. And this story, I could just picture this in my head, and it's very eerie, is when they searched the house, there was this gym in the basement that he used to work out in. And all of the walls for the gym were covered in mirrors. So it kind of, when you went in there, it had the effect of a house of mirrors. You couldn't really tell where things were.
it definitely would have created an eerie look for the people finding his body.
Yeah, because when they walked in, they didn't actually see him, but they saw him being reflected in the mirrors. And he had, well, I guess the word would be hung himself, but he had done it not by hanging like from a ceiling. He used gym equipment and kind of designed this thing to basically have himself strangled on a gym machine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So at this point, it's the family is dead. It's him deceased apparently by his own hand in the basement, his son in bed, his wife rolled up in a carpet in their bedroom.
Yeah, it's a horrific scene, and it's one of those things that you think you'd only see in a movie, but I can't imagine what it was like to find that. And especially from a world famous athlete, entertainer, I can't imagine what it was like.
Yeah. As what happens next, I'm always interested in, how media and news covers kind of major events. What happens next in the story is just baffling to me. So there's the major wrestling event Sunday night. It goes on without Chris Benoit being involved because he didn't show up. They had another wrestler fill in for him, and, the event went on. So that was a Sunday night pay-per-view, but Monday night is just a big night for wrestling on television. That they have Monday Night Raw, which is like a major television program where on Monday nights the wrestling occurs.
Yeah. And that goes on like that. Monday Night Raw is a 365 kind of. It's on every Monday night. There's no off season, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
And so Monday Night Raw is happening no matter what's going on in the world. That show is airing in some format. Whether people don't like it or not.
Yeah. Well, what ended up happening is the timing was just bad for as far as creating a show, because WWE and the higher ups had only found out about Chris's death that Sunday night. Going into Monday morning was when they learned about it, but they had no idea what happened, how he died. All they knew was that he didn't show up for the event and he was found dead. And the decision is made by the WWE to change the format of Monday Night Raw to instead make it like a memorial tribute to Chris Benoit that included celebrities and all the major wrestlers talking about, much like we heard about with they did for Eddie Guerrero, it's
right.
It's just the different wrestlers sitting in front of a camera, crying about this great, amazing guy who left such a great impact on their life. They didn't know what had happened and what he had done, and they made the very unfortunate decision to do this memorial tribute.
Yeah, definitely. In hindsight, it was not a great idea. And this kind of memorial is very common when a professional wrestler passes away suddenly. And when that happens, the very next televised event, they have a memorial for that performer. And so when they found out that Chris Benoit had passed away, it just happens every time that they wouldn't even have sat down to think, should we? They would have immediately said, Monday Night Raw is a tribute to Chris.
Good evening. Tonight, this arena here in Corpus Christi, Texas, was to have been filled to capacity with enthusiastic WWE fans. Tonight's storyline was to have been the alleged demise of my character, Mr. McMahon. However, in reality, WWE superstar Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel are dead. Their bodies were discovered this afternoon in their new suburban Atlanta home. The authorities are undergoing an investigation. We here in the WWE can only offer our condolences And the only other thing we can do at this moment is tonight pay tribute to Chris Benoit. We'll offer you some of the most memorable moments in Chris's professional life, and you'll hear tonight comments from his fellow performers, those here who loved Chris and admired him so much. So tonight will be a 3-hour tribute to one of the greatest WWE superstars of all time. Tonight will be a tribute to Chris Benoit.
So in the end, it was like, I think it was a couple hours long, just a tribute to the guy's life. And it almost, like, as the thing ended is when they began to find out that it was being investigated as a murder-suicide. And not only was Chris Benoit dead, but his wife and young son were. And I can only imagine the faces in the room when that got to the higher-ups at WWE who had just aired a memorial tribute to him.
I don't know what it would have been like in that boardroom of, like, what have we done?
There's no way around it. This is a huge PR disaster.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's a nightmare. They end up, the next event that they aired, that WWE aired, is like the last time they say his name. It pretty much starts with Vince McMahon, who's like the main guy of WWE, addresses the audience and basically says, "We won't be talking about Chris Benoit."
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Last night on Monday Night Raw, the WWE presented a special tribute show, recognizing the career of Chris Benoit. However, now some 26 hours later, the facts of this horrific tragedy are now apparent. Therefore, other than my comments, there will be no mention of Mr. Benoit's name tonight. On the contrary, tonight's show will be dedicated to everyone who has been affected by this terrible incident. This evening marks the first step of the healing process. Tonight, WWE performers will do what they do better than anyone else in the world: entertain you.
And from that point on, his name is like off limits, and he's erased from WWE history.
Completely erased. Like, you don't see an image of him. You don't see his name mentioned. Like, anything that any like release of a DVD or video set was, any match that had Chris in it was taken out, and you couldn't find a trace of him in the company records whatsoever.
Yeah, they even did like updates for the video games that had already been released, so that way when you're like your Xbox or whatever connected to the internet, it would apply an update that would remove him from the games in some cases. So they were, and what I've heard is that the wrestlers were all instructed to, like, never make reference to him. He doesn't exist, basically. And I completely understand why they would do that. It's just, it's notable because it's such a change in course from, the memorial tribute that they had just aired days prior, foolishly, in my opinion.
I find that one a complicated one because at the time, all they knew, or at least as far as I know anyway, all they knew was that he had died. And like that, to me, that was such standard practice to do a memorial the very next night, that who would have stopped and thought? Who would have possibly had the foresight to say, let's wait until the following week so we have details? Like, nobody would have imagined, based off of what they knew about Chris going into that memorial, that he would have done something like that. Nobody, there was no, like, you might have some people who were really close, that maybe, really close to the family and knew there was a bit of weirdness going on with him, that maybe they weren't surprised, but the general opinion of him was extremely positive. People respected him, and nobody, with the exception of maybe a small few, would have thought he would ever do something like that.
Yeah, I guess you're right. And it's when word gets out he's deceased, it's not like they could run Raw and not mention it. And then if they're going to mention it, you can't just not make a big deal. Just like, one of the main people died and, we're going to do something soon. I guess they were kind of backed into a corner.
Yeah, absolutely, because he was a main performer on that show. To try and to do a program with him just dying, them not knowing the details and just assuming that, maybe he's died of natural causes, maybe he's died of a drug overdose, maybe he's died of a number of other ways. So there's just no way that they would have thought, oh, maybe we should wait in case this is a murder-suicide. Like, it wasn't even a possibility to them at the time. It was, of course, we're going to do a memorial, because if we don't do a memorial, then we'll be criticized for that too. So, and then once the news came out of what really happened, they just struck him from the record and never mentioned him again. And then that was that.
Yeah, and I guess that makes sense. But they were dealt a pretty bad hand that Monday night, needing to do something. Sorry to pull you away from the episode, but I want to take a moment to thank the subscribers of the Nighttime Premium feed, as it's their support that makes this show possible. If any of you listening enjoy Nighttime and aren't subscribed to the premium feed, let me take a quick moment and explain what you're missing. For about the price of a cup of coffee, you can subscribe to a different podcast feed in which the episodes are posted earlier than here in the free feed and are done without any advertising. But there's more benefits to the premium feed than simply better versions of the free content. The premium feed also includes post-show discussions and a variety of additional content that will take you even further into the rabbit holes. So if you got a couple dollars to pitch in towards the creation of Nighttime, the premium feed is for you. You can access the premium feed at patreon.com/nighttimepodcast. So with that said, again, a huge thanks to all subscribers to the premium feed, and a thank you to everyone else listening for considering it. Now, let's get back to the episode. We have a pretty good idea now of what went on in the house, although there's still a ton of questions. What we know is that Friday, so the actual event that he didn't show up for was Sunday night. So just to give perspective here. So Friday night, Chris and his young son Daniel have a barbecue. Later on that night, we know that Chris and his wife Nancy had a fight. It's believed that at that point, Friday night is when he killed her. And the way he did it was with, it is kind of horrible to think about as any way to kill someone would be, but he did it with a phone cord in his knee against her back. She was found with like severe bruising on her lower back and was strangled with a phone cord. So what they think is that he used his knee, and he wraps her in a carpet Friday night and lays a Bible near her. He was a real religious guy, apparently, but he missed the section about killing people. The next Saturday, he's now alone in the house with his son. The next day, Saturday, fortunately, he drugged his son with Xanax before suffocating him in his bed. So his son hopefully doesn't realize or didn't realize, what happened to his mother or what happened to what his dad was doing to him is the only way I can, the best thing I can say about that. It's later on in the day that he phones Chavo and says, my wife and son are sick. I'm going to bring you to the hospital. I'm going to rebook the flight or whatever. That's when that happens. That night, Saturday night, he goes to sleep in the house with his dead son and wife in the house. Sunday morning, he gets up, and what's known about his Sunday morning is weird. They found like computer records showing things he was Googling. He was Googling stories from the Bible about, I don't know the Bible as well as as I should, I suppose. I shouldn't even say that. I don't know the Bible well, but it's about the stories of the prophet Elijah, who's a young boy who like died and was resurrected. He was like Googling stuff about this resurrection of a young boy, which is pretty eerie considering his son's dead in the house. Later on Sunday, he drinks a bottle of wine and kills himself with the gym equipment. So that's pretty much what's known about what went on in the house in the weekend. But that tells you enough to give you a good idea, but there's still a ton of questions and a ton of little mysteries within there. One thing I found eerie is in the crime scene, like in his son's bedroom, there's like a massive knife in the room.
Yeah, it's like under the bed or something?
Yeah, just like on the floor, just pushed slightly under the bed. And it's his son died by suffocation, but I don't know what the knife was doing in there. It may mean nothing, but it's just when you see crime scene photos of the knife laying under the bed, it's like, what the heck was going on? But in the end, it's something really, really dark went on within Chris Benoit and definitely within that house.
Yeah. It's I try not to think too much about how dark it would have been over those 2 days or whatever it was. Like, I can't, it's hard to think about. Like, yeah, it's unbelievable.
I'm sure this comes up a lot when someone does something horrible, is people saying, like, he wasn't the type of guy that would do that. I would never have guessed he could do that. He wasn't capable of doing that. And that points to, like, questioning what actually went on. Like, what was his motivation? What caused him to do this? Mm-hmm. And that almost opens this whole other door to this story, because there's kind of several things you can point at as being either responsible or playing a large role in it that all seem pretty likely. We can talk through some of them, but just to summarize, it's really, he is known to be a steroid user since like high school, which is a big part of wrestling. And everybody who knows about steroids knows about roid rage and gets the concept of that. So that's one thing people look at. Another thing...
Yeah, that was the first thing that people jumped to in the early stages of the story in the media was, roid rage and the history of steroids in the wrestling business was something that the WWE was being attacked for in the early stages of the story. So that was the very first thing that people went to.
Yeah, and there was steroids found in his home. Like it was no secret or question that he was a heavy user, and that, like you said, that led to some heavy criticism of WWE and their testing practices for their entertainers and whatnot. So that was one thing, but then the other is Chris Benoit, like you said, heavily athletic and tons of action in his matches. He took a lot of bumps during his career, and his autopsy had shown that he had severe brain damage and brain injury from repeated concussions. And that can have, all sorts of horrible effects on your mental state. And he even, in a kind of a telling thing, is before this all happened, Chris Benoit was actively trying to connect with people who were researching the effects of brain damage from concussions. Like he seemed to know it was a problem.
Yeah, he could probably tell that something wasn't right. And when you look back at his career and you look back at the chair shots that he would take to the head, not just him, but every wrestler during that era took steel chair shots directly to the head. And this is another misconception by people who maybe don't watch professional wrestling a lot or at all. They see the chair shots and they think it's a fake chair or it's a staged kind of prop chair or something like that. But those are real steel chairs. And they're really connecting with those because it's kind of like a almost like a rite of passage, or like a kind of a macho kind of thing, is you have to take the chair shot head on, and you need the sound and you need the impact, and if you get busted open, all the better. So those are real chairs, and they are swinging them as hard as they can. And you're taking those during the 90s and the early 2000s, you were taking chair shots all the time to the head. And to think about it now, chair shots have been banned to the head. Now when you see someone take a chair shot, it's to the back because it absorbs the impact a lot more. So there's less likely to cause permanent damage. But so you're no longer allowed to hit somebody in the head with a chair. And if you do, you're fined quite a bit.
Wow. Because that was such a big thing when I was a kid watching wrestling. They were always hitting each other over the head with chairs, and
always. And when you were a kid, I always kind of assumed that they had fake chairs.
Yeah, me too. But
But then when I got older and started to kind of read up about the business a lot more, the kind of behind the scenes stuff, you realize these are real chairs and they are hitting each other as hard as they can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's not always about, like, when people say wrestling is fake and whatnot, it's not always about, like, the punch just completely missing and the kicks missing and the slams, not doing anything. They train in a way to, in a lot of cases, still connect, but do the least amount of damage. So I guess, like, smacking someone over the head with a chair, They were probably trying to find the way to do it as safe as possible. But at the end of the day, you're still a guy getting smacked over the head with a chair, 25 times a year or something like that, if not more.
It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how you take it. There's a sweet spot that they say you can hit, where it's kind of, easier, I guess. But all they're concerned about is the impact, the sound, the look. Mm-hmm. Their welfare is second or third on the list.
Yeah. Then another thing specific to Chris Benoit, when you talk about concussions and brain injury and brain damage, is, and this is always a cool thing, but every wrestler kind of has like their finishing move, like the main move they do to, when their opponent's weakened to finish them off or whatever. His was seen as one of the more dangerous moves because he would jump. Like, he would do like a flying headbutt. He would jump off of the top of the ropes and headbutt a downed opponent. I'm sure, like, if he did that move 25 times a year, I'm sure he probably missed connecting with their head 24 times a year. But if you jumped off of, say like a 3 or 4 foot high thing and just landed on someone forehead to forehead, like, that would, for me, if I did that, I think I'd be in the hospital for 6 months before I'd be able to, like, get out.
Yeah, and he would do that move every night. Mm-hmm. So he's wrestling, probably 300, maybe 320 nights a year at that time, or throughout his career. So he's doing that flying headbutt constantly. And that was a move that he got from the Dynamite Kid that we talked about earlier from Stampede Wrestling and the British Bulldogs. That was a move that the Dynamite Kid did. And the Dynamite Kid ended up in a wheelchair. That's kind of these moves, although they try to perform them in the safest way they can, still their number one priority is making it look as real as they can. Mm-hmm. And you do that, as many times through the year as these performers do. That's going to take a massive toll on your body. Mm-hmm.
So he had, the way I see this story playing out is, so Chris Benoit had, in my mind anyway, likely was suffering some effects of brain injury. He likely was feeling some effects of years of steroid abuse. He was also taking testosterone, which is not uncommon for people who've taken steroids. Your body's not producing as much testosterone. So he had stuff going on medically, stuff going on with his brain in most cases. He had most likely, he had the death of his best friend, who is more like, the relationship seems more like brothers or something, when Eddie Guerrero died. So that likely had some of the same effect of a rug being pulled out from under him. But on top of that, he also seemed to have a troubled relationship with his wife, Nancy. She had, at one point, not long before this, she had a restraining order against him for after he assaulted her, but not a lot's known about it. It seemed like they kept it pretty hush-hush, and I haven't read too much about what exactly happened, but I do know that he physically attacked her and ended up with, at least temporarily, with a restraining order before they got back together. But all in all, the picture this story paints is this hurricane spinning around Chris Benoit, who is a huge celebrity worth millions of dollars at the height of his career, with other factors coming into play that eventually lead to just an explosion of tragedy that leaves him dead, his wife dead, and most tragically, his young son dead, who, that part of the story I don't even like to think about that, but it's, the whole thing is just a nightmare. And as you said today, if you were a wrestling fan, even the most diehard wrestling fan that watches every little bit of WWE and reads everything it publishes, you would never know Chris Benoit exists because they have completely blocked him from, any mention. Even the old DVDs and stuff they sell, his image is removed or his matches are cut. It must be hard because they're a media company who produces a ton of content. To remove a major part of that, that must be tough.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, they have a massive team of editors, I'm sure, that, probably went into overtime to be able to move as fast as possible to erase him from the record. So it's a really weird story in the sense that there's so many angles to it, like the brain damage and the career and the horrific crimes, because you have people that, backstage were so close to Chris, and then he was this person that they looked up to, and he has a son from another wife, I think his first wife, who's still alive, and
David, I believe. He's living out west in Canada, and it looks just like Chris Benoit.
Looks just like him, and still loves wrestling, and still loves his dad.
Yeah, I looked up his son, his older son David, and who wasn't living with Chris at the time of this murders, but his oldest son David. When I found him, it's like all the photos are him with other wrestlers, like other major wrestlers that would have been Chris Benoit's, friends and stuff, but he's still very much involved in it.
Yeah.
Which must be very hard for him to, deal with that.
Well,
to have that shadow.
Yeah. Like his life is forever kind of shadowed by what his father did, to his brother and to Nancy. And then you have the argument of separating the art from that the performer creates to the person. It's like when you go back and watch those matches, they're still amazing matches, if you can get a hold of one. But then there's this, a whole other story on top of it of the murders and what Chris ended up doing. And then you think about the reasons why, the brain damage and the toll on his body over years of wrestling, and it's just so complicated. It's not as cut and dry as you would like something like this to be. You would like to say evil and good and make it simple, but it's not. It's
never that way.
No.
And like the idea, like the amount of toll, like the toll wrestling would take on your body. I'm sure you've seen the movie The Wrestler.
Yeah.
That movie was so good, and it really highlights what these guys go through. Although the movie The Wrestler more so shows like the life of like an aging wrestler who can't let it go, but it just in that career, now as an adult looking at what life as a wrestler would be, it's definitely not what I would have expected as a young kid watching wrestling.
No, it's very glamorized when you're a child watching it. These are superheroes, and they're kings and queens. But when you get older and you start to see these real life stories play out and learn about them, you realize what a tough industry that is. And like, these wrestlers love it so much that they're willing to put their bodies and their lives and their families through all that, through the constantly, being on the road and never being home, the pain, the hotels, the drug abuse, everything that comes along with them, the injuries, and they all say, I love this business. I love it. I wouldn't do anything else. I'll do anything for this business. It's a real, it's a different kind of animal altogether. And, but then this particular story is the worst kind of tragedy that I've read about in wrestling.
I want to end by saying that this story is simply awful. I try to avoid covering anything that involves crimes against children, as it really takes a lot out of me to even consider it. And that's why Aaron and I avoided speaking too much about what may have actually happened in the Benoit house. But why and how something like this can happen? Well, I only hope someone can figure it out, and that knowledge can go on to help prevent tragedies like this from happening in the future. So with that said, let's wrap this up. But before we do, I have some thanks. First of all, a big thanks to Aaron Corbett for again joining me here on Nighttime. But the most important thanks goes out to all the listeners of the show. Without your interest and your support, this show would have seen the light of day many moons ago. And with that said, if you want to help keep the lights out here at Nighttime, please subscribe to the premium feed, as it's what makes the show possible. And with that said, let me thank the newest subscribers to the premium feed: Gary P., Halifax's own Stu Metz, and Angie M. Thank you for your generous support. And for anyone else out there who'd like to support the show but can't help financially, you can give me a big hand by simply liking and sharing the episodes on social media. And if any of you listening want to stay up to date with my activities, find me on social media. I use Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and my handle is @NighttimePod. And if you have any story ideas or want to give feedback on the show, you can reach me at nighttimepodcast.com/contact. Now until next time, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and check in on anyone who seems to be struggling with something.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte. Copyright Jordan Bonaparte.